Hey guys, today we are diving into something most people have never heard about: the myths of the North. You already know the names of Odin, Thor, or Loki. But let me ask you this. Have you ever wondered what stories were left out of the sagas? What legends were too strange, too dark, or too confusing to survive in the mainstream tales of the Vikings? This is where things get interesting, because behind the well-known gods and heroes, there are forgotten myths hidden in the cracks of history tales. Whispered from one mouth to another in wooden halls during long winters, these stories were not always written down, and many of them reveal a side of the Viking world that feels almost alien to us today. Some even clash with what we think we know about Norse culture. Before we go deeper, I want to invite you to be part of this exploration with me. If you are fascinated by the hidden side of Viking lore, then leave a thought in the comments about which god or myth you would want to uncover more. And if you enjoy learning about the strange and overlooked corners of history, make sure to stick around, because the stories coming up might change how you see the entire Viking world. Let's start with something unexpected. When we think of the Norse gods, we picture strength and power. But there are myths that show them as vulnerable, even awkward. For example, in one old poem, Odin, the All-Father, is not the wise, perfect leader we often imagine. Instead, he is seen wandering the world in disguise, sometimes being tricked, sometimes even humiliated. One lost tale suggests that Odin once challenged a simple farmer in a contest, aint of knowledge, and failed. The idea that the king of the gods could be bested by a mortal shows us how fluid and surprising these myths could be. Then there is the strange story of Heimdall. The watchman of the gods most know him as the guardian of the Rainbow Bridge, the one with eyes and ears sharper than any being. But one hidden story says that Heimdall was born from 9 mothers. All at once, the details are murky. Some versions say they were sea maidens. Others claim they were giantesses. Either way, the idea of 9 women giving birth to one child defies logic. Yet for the Vikings, this was a way of saying that Heimdall was connected to the ocean, to magic, and to the forces of nature themselves. Another curious myth that rarely gets attention involves Thor, not in his usual role as the mighty hammer wielder, but in a tale where he loses his weapon. Mjolnir was stolen and hidden by giants, and the only way to get it back was for Thor to dress up as a bride, wearing a wedding gown and veil, pretending to be Freya, the goddess of love. This might sound like comedy, but in reality, it showed that even the strongest warrior god had to rely on disguise and wit. It also hinted at how gender roles and appearances were not always fixed in Norse stories. Some of the forgotten myths also explore darker sides of the cosmos. Take the story of Gullveig, a mysterious woman who came to the gods and was burned 3 times. But each time she was reborn. This tale may sound short, but it is one of the sparks that led to the great war between the 2 tribes of gods, the Aesir and the Vanir. As hidden here is the idea of resilience and rebirth, but also the dangerous power of women in Norse imagination. Gullveig represents greed and magic, yet she cannot be destroyed no matter how much fire they throw at her. And then there are myths that never reached the mainstream because they were simply too strange. One example is the belief that the world was not just guarded by gods, but also by strange animals and spirits. Some tales say that a giant eagle sat at the top of the world tree Yggdrasil, while a serpent coiled around its roots, carrying messages of hate between them. A squirrel ran up and down the trunk, spreading gossip. The fact that even a squirrel could have a cosmic role shows us how differently the Norse saw the universe compared to how we imagine it today. What these myths reveal is that Viking culture was not only about heroes and battles, it was about mystery, about accepting that the world was unpredictable and full of forces that could not always be controlled. When you hear about Odin, Thor, and Loki, you get the surface story. But when you look at these forgotten tales, you start to see how the people of the North truly thought about life, death, and everything in between. And this is only the beginning. In the next part, we will go deeper into the myths that were deliberately left out of the official sagas, tales that might reveal values, fears, and desires that the Vikings preferred to keep in the shadows, rather than bring into the light. One of the strangest myths, almost never told in popular culture, is about the mead of poetry. This was not just a drink. It was a magical substance, said to give wisdom and skill in verse to anyone who tasted it. The story goes that it was created from the blood of a wise man mixed with honey. It was guarded by giants and eventually stolen by Odin, who shapeshifted into an eagle to escape with it. The hidden detail here is that not all poetry or wisdom was considered noble. Some legends say that when Odin spilled part of the mead on his flight, it became the source of bad poetry. That explained why some verse was inspiring and some was clumsy. This shows how the Vikings saw even art and knowledge as something that came with risk and imperfection. There is also the story of Skadi, the giantess who became one of the most fascinating figures in Norse myth. She wanted vengeance against the gods for the death of her father. But instead of going to war, she demanded compensation in an unusual way. She was allowed to choose a husband from among the gods, but she could only look at their feet. She chose what she thought were the most handsome feet, hoping they belonged to Balder, the beautiful god. But instead, they belonged to Njord, a sea god. This strange twist reveals a hidden theme about fate and how choices often led to unexpected outcomes. In Viking imagination, even the gods could not escape mistakes and irony. Other forgotten stories touch on the underworld beyond the famous Hall of Valhalla. There were other destinations for the dead. One of them was Hell, a place ruled by the goddess of the same name. Not all warriors went to Odin's Hall. Only a select few. The rest could end up in Hell or other realms depending on how they lived and died. Some myths describe Hell not as a place of torment, but as a quiet, shadowy realm where life simply continued in another form. It is surprising to realize that for many Vikings, the afterlife was not about reward or punishment, but about a continuation of existence in a different state. There are also rare myths about Loki that paint him in a different light than the usual trickster. Some sagas hint at moments when Loki was not only mischievous, but deeply necessary. In one story, he helps the gods by finding treasures that became their most iconic symbols, like Odin's spear or Thor's hammer. Yet in another strange tale, he turns into a mare and gives birth to an 8-legged horse named Sleipnir, which later becomes Odin's steed. This blending of chaos, creation, and even gender bending made Loki one of the most unpredictable figures in myth. Perhaps this is one of the reasons why so many of his stories were softened or erased in later retellings. Another hidden piece of Norse lore is the concept of fate woven by the Norns. These were 3 mysterious women who lived by the roots of Yggdrasil, carving runes into wood and weaving threads of destiny. They were not gods, but something beyond. Even the gods themselves were subject to their weaving. One tale says that Odin himself sought their wisdom, but could never change what was already woven. This raises deep questions about freedom, choice, and inevitability in Viking belief. Did the gods truly rule the cosmos, or were they too bound by forces greater than themselves? There are also minor myths about animals and symbols that rarely get mentioned. For example, cats were sacred to Freyja, the goddess of love and fertility. She rode in a chariot pulled by giant cats, a detail that seems almost whimsical, yet shows how everyday animals were connected to divine forces. Another overlooked symbol was the boar, often linked with fertility and protection. Some myths describe golden boars shining with light, leading warriors through the night. The inclusion of such creatures in the myths suggests how strongly the Norse saw the natural world as alive with meaning. When you put these forgotten myths together, you start to see a much more complex image of the Viking mind. They were not just warriors. They were storytellers who embraced paradox. Their gods could be powerful and foolish, wise and foolish at the same time. Their universe was vast, filled with gods, giants, spirits, animals, and unseen forces. Every action carried meaning. This hidden side of Norse mythology invites us to think about how stories are shaped across time. The myths we know today are the ones that survived through the sagas written centuries later. But before that, they were told by firelight, sung by skalds, and changed with every telling. Some were probably lost forever. Others remained only in fragments, pieces of a puzzle that we will never fully complete. In the next part, we will keep unraveling these lesser-known myths, tales that reveal the raw human fears behind them, myths of betrayal, curses, and prophecies that even the gods could not escape. In Norse mythology, there are stories that sound more like riddles than myths. They are not about great battles or famous heroes. They are about strange creatures and events that people in the Viking Age used to whisper about. These stories were not always written down in the big sagas. Instead, they survived in fragments. Some were told by travelers. Others came from poets who wanted to impress a king or make people laugh around a fire. Because of this, many of these myths feel hidden. They are like shadows on the edges of the bigger stories. One example is the myth of the dwarves and how they came to control so many treasures. Most people think of dwarves only as makers of Thor's hammer or Odin's spear. But there are stories that suggest they had a whole world of their own. In some poems, they are described almost like spirits who lived in rocks and underground rivers. They were not just smiths. They were guardians of secrets. A tale rarely told says that certain dwarves could shapeshift into animals. Some even turned into mist or smoke to escape danger. Imagine the fear of meeting a dwarf in human form who could disappear into the air before you touched him. That would make people think twice before trying to steal from them. Another forgotten myth is about the sea goddess Ran. Many people have heard of Aegir, the giant who brewed beer for the gods. But Ran was his wife, and she was far more terrifying. She had a net that she used to drag sailors down into the sea. To the Vikings, drowning was not just an accident. It was Ran taking her payment. Fishermen feared her because they believed every catch was tied to her mood. If she was pleased, she let them return home. If she was angry, she took them. Some stories even say that she could keep drowned men as her guests. That meant entire crews vanished into her halls beneath the waves. This myth mattered because it gave people a way to explain why so many lives were lost at sea. It also shows how much fear and respect the Vikings had for the ocean that surrounded them. Now let us talk about Loki in a way that is rarely explored. Everyone knows Loki as the trickster, but there are smaller stories where his role is more unsettling. In one myth, he borrows the shape of a bird and steals a feather cloak. In another, he is said to have given birth to a strange horse after turning into a mare. But one of the lesser-known tales says Loki once disguised himself as an old woman and sat at the edge of the world weaving. The story is not very long. It simply says the gods did not recognize him until it was too late. This image of Loki weaving at the edge of the world feels mysterious. Some scholars think it means he was tied to fate itself, like the Norse, who wove the destiny of gods and men. If that is true, then Loki was more than just a troublemaker. He was someone who could touch the threads of destiny. That makes his later betrayal in Ragnarok even more powerful. There is also the strange myth of the rooster named Gullinkambi. This bird was said to sit in Valhalla. When it crowed, it would announce the beginning of Ragnarok. But what most people do not know is that there were other roosters too. One in the land of giants, another in the underworld. All of them were meant to crow at the same time. Imagine the sound of 3 roosters echoing across the worlds. That was the signal that everything was ending. This detail gets ignored in popular stories, but it shows how the Vikings believed signs and warnings were everywhere. Even something as simple as the crow of a rooster could mean doom for gods and men alike. Hidden myths often show us the Viking view of morality. Take the story of Starkad, a warrior cursed to live many lifetimes. He was given gifts by the gods, but also terrible punishments. In one life, he would be rich. In another, he would live in shame. He would be both a hero and a traitor. This myth is strange because it does not have a clear lesson. It feels more like an exploration of what it means to live many lives full of contradictions. Starkad is almost forgotten today. But to the Vikings, he was a way of showing that even great warriors were not purely good or bad. They were human, with all their flaws multiplied across lifetimes. Another little-known myth is about the goddess Gefjon. She is remembered as the one who plowed the land that became Zealand in Denmark. But there are other whispers about her role as a chooser of maidens. Some poems describe her as leading the souls of young women who died before marriage. Instead of Valhalla or hell, they went with her. This is not often told because it is not grand or dramatic. Yet it reveals how the Vikings thought about death and the afterlife in more personal terms. Not everyone had to be a warrior. Some found peace with a goddess who cared for those who never had a full life. What makes these forgotten myths important is that they widen the picture of Norse belief. The sagas about Odin, Thor, and Freya are the ones everyone knows. They are full of battles and magic weapons. But in the shadows, we find dwarves turning to smoke, a sea goddess dragging men into the waves, a trickster weaving at the edge of the world, roosters crowing in 3 different realms, a cursed warrior living countless lives, a quiet goddess leading lost souls. These myths do not just entertain. They show us that the Viking imagination was vast. It did not only celebrate power, it also explored fear, fate, and mystery. When you put all these fragments together, you begin to see why the Norse world was so rich. Life for them was not simple. It was not black and white. Their myths reflected that. Every god had flaws. Every creature had secrets. Every moment could be a sign of something greater. And maybe that is why these hidden stories still matter. They remind us that even in a world of warriors and kings, people wanted to tell strange, quiet tales that touched on the unknown. The Norse myths we rarely hear about are often the ones that feel the most human. They are not always about gods fighting giants or heroes winning battles. Sometimes they are about mistakes, jealousy, or choices that went wrong. These stories are like windows into how people in the Viking Age thought about love, betrayal, and fate. They show us the emotional side of mythology, not just the heroic side. One myth that often stays hidden is about Freyja, the goddess of love and beauty. Everyone knows she had the necklace called Brisingamen, but the story of how she got it is not often told in full. The myth says 4 dwarves made the necklace. Each of them wanted to lie with her in exchange for giving it to her. She agreed, and when she wore the necklace, it became the most beautiful jewel in all the worlds. This myth is rarely mentioned because it does not show her as perfect. Instead, it shows her as someone willing to make choices that others might judge. But for the Vikings, beauty and power often came with a price. Freya's story is not just about a necklace. It is about how desire, bargaining, and sacrifice were part of life. Another forgotten story is about Odin and his endless hunger for knowledge. We all know he sacrificed an eye to drink from the well of wisdom. But in one myth, he went even further. He hanged himself on the world tree for 9 nights, pierced by his own spear. He did this not for glory, but to discover the secrets of the runes. Imagine that image. The chief of the gods hanging like a corpse, suffering for days, just to find hidden knowledge. This is not a glorious battle. It is pain and sacrifice. It shows that even the highest god had to suffer to gain wisdom. That is not a tale of strength. It is a tale of endurance, patience, and the cost of knowledge. It tells us that for the Vikings, wisdom was not free. It had to be earned with blood and pain. The myths also reveal how the gods were not always noble. Take the story of Thor and his journey to the hall of Utgard Loki. Thor thought he was the strongest. He boasted that no one could beat him. But in Utgard Loki's hall, he faced a series of challenges that humbled him. He tried to lift a giant cat but only managed to raise one of its paws. He tried to drink from a horn but could not finish it. He wrestled with an old woman and lost. Later, he learned that the cat was actually the Midgard serpent. The horn was the ocean, and the old woman was old age itself. These tricks taught Thor that even he had limits. This story is rarely told in full detail because it is not about victory. It is about being fooled. But it carries a powerful message. Even the strongest can be humbled. Even gods can be tricked by forces greater than themselves. Another hidden myth is about Balder, the shining god. Most people know he was killed by a mistletoe dart, but the details of how it happened are often left out. The gods made a game of throwing weapons at him because everything in the world had sworn not to harm him. But Loki found out that mistletoe had been forgotten. He placed a dart of mistletoe in the hands of Balder's blind brother Hoder. When Hoder threw it, Balder was struck and killed. What is hidden here is the cruelty of the game itself. Imagine laughing while spears and axes are thrown at a friend, all because you think he cannot be hurt. This shows the arrogance of the gods. It also shows how tragedy can come not just from enemies, but from games and carelessness. We also find forgotten stories about Hel, the ruler of the underworld. Most people picture her as cold and silent, but in some tales she is more complex. She was Loki's daughter, half alive and half dead. The gods sent her away because they feared her, but in the underworld she became a queen. Some poems describe her not as evil, but as fair. She gave the dead a place to rest. Not everyone could go to Valhalla. Most people ended up with Hel. This is rarely spoken of because it does not fit the heroic image. Yet it shows that for the Vikings, death was not always about glory. It was often about peace. Hel's story reminds us that even in a world of warriors, most lives ended quietly. There are also myths that deal with prophecy. The Norns, the weavers of fate, appear in many stories, but their full power is often ignored. They were not just background figures. They decided the lifespan of gods and men. They watered the world tree to keep it alive. They carved runes that no one could erase. In some myths, even Odin himself feared them. This hidden detail changes how we see the whole mythology. It tells us that no matter how powerful the gods seemed, there were forces above them. Fate was unbreakable. Another fascinating but little-known myth involves the giantess Skadi. She married the sea god Njord after demanding a husband as payment for her father's death. But when they tried to live together, it did not work. Njord loved the sea and the cries of seabirds. Skadi loved the mountains and the howls of wolves. Neither could be happy in the other's home. They separated and went back to their own lands. This myth is rarely told because it does not have a grand ending, but it shows a simple truth. Even in mythology, relationships fail. Even gods and giants could not always find balance. That makes the myth strangely modern. It is about love, compromise, and the reality that not all unions work out. The hidden side of Norse mythology also includes tales that sound almost like dreams. In one poem, a man describes traveling through strange lands where rivers run with swords and trees drip with poison. He meets creatures with faces of flame and sees halls filled with serpents. These images are not tied to one clear story. They feel like visions. They show us how the Vikings imagined the unknown. They turned fear into poetry. They described the world beyond the edges of maps. These visions might not have been meant as literal myths. They were more like warnings or meditations, but they are still part of the hidden layers of Norse storytelling. All of these stories remind us that mythology is not just about the battles everyone knows. It is about strange bargains, hidden sacrifices, and unexpected lessons. Freya trading nights with dwarves for beauty. Odin hanging himself on the tree for knowledge. Thor being humbled by illusions. The gods playing a deadly game with Balder. Hel offering peace instead of glory. Skadi and Njord proving that even divine marriages can fail. The Norns showing that fate rules all, and visions of rivers of swords reminding us of the fears that haunted the imagination of the North. These myths matter because they make the gods feel real. They are not flawless. They are not always victorious. They are complex, flawed, and vulnerable. just like the people who told their stories. That is why the hidden side of Norse mythology is so powerful. It shows us not just what the Vikings admired, but what they feared, what they questioned, and what they dreamed of. When we look deeper into Norse myths, there is always something unexpected hiding in the shadows. We usually remember the loud tales, Thor crushing giants, Odin riding his horse across the sky, Loki playing his tricks. But beneath these famous stories are details and myths that almost never get told. These forgotten pieces can be strange, sometimes disturbing, and often more honest about life than the popular tales. One of those myths is the story of Kvasir. Not everyone knows his name. Kvasir was not a god in the usual sense. He was created when the gods spat into a bowl to seal a truce after their war. From that spit he was born, a man filled with wisdom. He traveled the world answering every question people asked him. But his story does not end in glory. 2 dwarves killed him and drained his blood. They mixed it with honey to brew the mead of poetry. Whoever drank it could gain wisdom and become a poet. This story is rarely told because it is strange. The wisest man is murdered. His blood becomes a drink, and that drink is fought over by gods and giants. It is a myth about creation and destruction at the same time. The wisdom of Kvasir came from violence. The gift of poetry came from death. That is a brutal truth hidden behind the beauty of Norse poetry. Another hidden myth involves Loki. Most people know him as the trickster who caused trouble, but fewer know the tale of Loki giving birth. After the gods made a wall around Asgard, a giant demanded payment. The giant asked for the sun, the moon, and the goddess Freya if he finished the wall in time. The gods agreed, but secretly planned for him to fail. When the giant came close to finishing the wall, his horse Svadilfari worked so hard that the deal might actually succeed. Loki transformed into a mare to lure the horse away. He seduced it. Later, Loki gave birth to a foal with 8 legs. That foal was Sleipnir, the fastest horse in the world, who became Odin's mount. This story is rarely told in full because it is shocking. A male god turning into a female horse, giving birth. Yet it shows how Norse myths did not shy away from strange transformations. They accepted fluid identities, and they explained power and gifts through acts that would seem bizarre to us today. Sleipnir became one of the most important creatures in Norse myth, and his birth came from one of the strangest stories ever told. There are also myths about gods failing in ways we do not usually see. For example, Tyr. He was the god of law and justice, but he is best remembered for losing his hand to the wolf Fenrir. The gods wanted to bind Fenrir because they feared his strength. They tricked the wolf with a magical chain. Fenrir agreed to be bound only if one of the gods placed a hand in his mouth as a sign of trust. Tyr was the only one brave enough. When Fenrir realized the gods had deceived him, he bit off Tyr's hand. After that, Tyr was a god of justice who carried the mark of sacrifice. This myth is not told as often as Thor's hammer or Odin's wisdom because it is painful. It shows that justice sometimes means loss. It shows that honor is not free. Tyr kept order among the gods, but he paid a price. That hidden message makes the myth powerful. It is not about triumph. It is about the cost of doing the right thing. Another myth that is almost forgotten is the tale of Rig. Rig was a god often linked with Heimdall. In one poem, he wandered the world visiting human households. He lay with 3 women of different classes. From these unions came the ancestors of thralls, farmers, and nobles. This story explained the origin of social classes among humans. It was not about glory or battle. It was about why people lived such different lives. Some were slaves. Some worked the land. Some ruled. The myth of Rig is not told often because it touches on inequality. It suggests that the gods themselves created the divisions of society. That is not a heroic message, but it is a hidden truth about how Vikings saw the world. Their society was not equal, and they used myth to explain why. There are also eerie myths about Ragnarok that people rarely mention. Everyone knows it is the final battle where gods and giants destroy each other. But some sources say that not all gods die. A few survive and walk on new green lands after the chaos ends. Balder returns from the dead. Hoder returns too. The sons of Thor carry his hammer. The sons of Odin carry on his line. This hidden part of the story changes the way we see Ragnarok. It is not just about destruction. It is also about renewal. It is about death and rebirth. That makes it more than an apocalypse. It is a cycle. For the Vikings, it meant that even when everything falls, there can be a new beginning. Another forgotten piece of mythology involves Ymir, the first giant. Most people know he was killed by Odin and his brothers. They used his body to create the world. His blood became the oceans. His bones became mountains. His skull became the sky. But fewer people talk about what that means. The entire world is made of the corpse of a giant. That is a dark idea. Life itself comes from death. Every step on the ground is a step on Ymir's body. Every breath under the sky is a breath beneath his skull. This is not a pretty myth, but it shows how the Vikings saw creation. They did not imagine a gentle beginning. They imagined violence and sacrifice shaping reality itself. We also find hidden myths about lesser-known beings. There were land spirits that protected farms. There were sea spirits that guided ships or sank them. Some sagas mention women who walked the night carrying curses. Others speak of trolls who lived in caves and demanded offerings. These myths were never written in the big poems of the gods. They lived in local tales told around fires. They reveal how myth was not only about Asgard and giants. It was also about the daily fears and hopes of people. Will the land give good harvests? Will the sea swallow our boats? Will the night bring curses? These hidden myths were close to the heart of ordinary life. Another fascinating but often overlooked myth is about Idun and her apples. Idun was the goddess who kept the apples of youth. Without her, the gods would grow old. One day, Loki tricked her into leaving Asgard. A giant kidnapped her, and the gods began to wither. Only when Loki rescued her did they return to their strength. This story is known, but the deeper meaning is often left out. The gods were not eternal by themselves. They needed Idun's apples to stay young. Without her, they were fragile. That is a hidden truth. The gods who seemed invincible were dependent on a single goddess and her magic fruit. We also find myths that are not so much stories as fragments. A verse about a hall where snakes drip venom from the roof. A mention of a rooster crowing at the start of Ragnarok. A line about a ship made of dead men's nails. These strange details sit in the background. They are rarely explained, but they add weight to the mythic world. They show how dark and surreal Norse imagination could be. The ship of nails called Naglfar is a perfect example. It was said to carry giants into battle at Ragnarok, and it was built slowly from the nails of the dead. That detail is chilling. It tells us that every burial added to the fleet of doom. This hidden fragment makes us see how myth and death were always linked. The hidden myths matter because they change the way we see the whole picture. They remind us that Norse mythology was not just about heroes with hammers. It was also about blood turned to mead, about gods who lost hands, about tricksters who gave birth, about social classes shaped by divine unions, about worlds built from corpses, about fates woven by unseen hands. Each hidden myth adds depth. Each one makes the Viking imagination richer and stranger. If we only remember the loud stories, we miss the quiet lessons. The hidden myths show us the cost of wisdom, the fragility of gods, the cruelty of games, the renewal after destruction. They remind us that mythology was never meant to be neat. It was meant to be full of wonder and fear. It was meant to explain a world that was harsh and unpredictable. And that is why the hidden myths are the ones worth telling. The hidden myths of the North are not only strange. Some are terrifying. They show us how the Vikings imagined death and the forces beyond human control. These stories are not the ones people tell in casual books about Thor or Odin. They are darker, more unsettling, and they often reveal what the Norse feared the most. One of the most haunting myths is the story of Hel. Many know her name, but fewer know the details. She was the daughter of Loki and the giantess Angrboda. When the gods saw her, they were horrified. Half of her body was alive and fair. The other half was dead and rotting. Odin sent her to rule the realm of the dead. Her hall was called Eldjudnir. Its walls were high. Its gate was massive. Its bed was called sick bed. Its blanket was called disease. For the Vikings, this was not just imagination. It was a mirror of the sickness and death that they saw around them. Hel was not a villain in the modern sense. She was a ruler who received those who did not die in battle. The old, the sick, the forgotten. This myth is rarely told because it is not heroic, but it is important because it shows the other side of the afterlife. Not everyone went to Valhalla. Most went to hell. Another chilling myth involves the Draugr. These were the undead of Norse belief. They were not ghosts. They were corpses that walked, huge, heavy, sometimes growing in size as they fought. They guarded treasure. They attacked the living. They carried the smell of decay. Some sagas describe how a hero had to fight a Draugr in its burial mound. The fight was brutal because the Draugr was almost unstoppable. To kill one, you had to cut off its head or burn it. These myths were not just stories for fun. They warned about the restless dead. They gave shape to fears of improper burial or greed beyond the grave. When we think of Viking myths, we imagine gods and giants. But many of the stories that people whispered at night were about Draugr. They were the monsters of their world. There is also the myth of Nidhogg, the dragon that lives beneath the world tree, Yggdrasil. While the eagle sits at the top and the squirrel runs between branches, Nidhogg gnaws at the roots. He feeds on corpses and chews the foundation of existence. He is rarely shown in the grand paintings of Norse myth, but he is always there, eating, waiting. He represents decay that never stops. Even the cosmic tree that holds the 9 worlds is not safe from him. The image is powerful. Life grows, gods fight, heroes rise. but deep below the dragon is chewing. That is a hidden truth the Vikings understood well. Nothing lasts forever. Another forgotten myth is about the seeress. In the poem, Völuspá Odin calls a dead woman from her grave to speak about the future. She tells him about the beginning of the world. She tells him about the end. She describes the doom of gods. This myth is strange because it shows Odin as desperate. He is the All-Father, yet he goes to the dead for answers. He needs wisdom from someone beyond his power. The voice of the seeress is one of the most haunting in all Norse lore. She speaks of fire, of wolves, of gods falling, of a new earth rising. Her words are not gentle. They are grim. They remind us that even gods cannot escape fate. We also find darker myths in fragments about curses. In some sagas, people carve runes that bring sickness. A woman once carved runes on a whalebone to harm a rival. The rival fell ill until the runes were discovered and burned. These stories are small, but they reveal how the Vikings believed in magic that could wound as much as heal. Not all runes were used for protection. Some were weapons. The fear of curses was real. People could die if they believed enough in the spell cast upon them. The myths of runes are often told as tales of wisdom and secret knowledge. But there is also a shadow side. Runes could twist fate and bring ruin. Another eerie myth is about the giantess Angroda herself. She was the mother not only of Hel, but also of Fenrir, the wolf, and Jormungandr, the world serpent. Together, these three children were seen as the doom of the gods. Fenrir would kill Odin. Jormungandr would poison Thor. Hel would rule over the dead. This myth is unsettling because it shows one family line creating the greatest threats to Asgard. The gods tried to control it. They bound Fenrir. They threw Jormungandr into the sea. They banished Hel to the underworld. But their actions only set the stage for Ragnarok. The myth suggests that trying to prevent fate can help cause it. That is a theme that runs through many hidden Norse stories. There are also myths about the Norns. These were the women who sat by the roots of Yggdrasil and wove the fate of gods and men. Their names were Urd, Verdandi, Skuld, past, present, future. Even Odin feared them, because no one could escape what they wove. This is rarely emphasized in simple retellings of Norse myth, but it is crucial. The Norns remind us that the gods were not fully in control. They were trapped in the same weave as mortals. When Ragnarok came, it was because the Norns had written it so. For the Vikings, this was not depressing. It was reality. Fate was a force no one could bargain with. Another hidden story is about the death of Balder. Many know the short version. Balder, the beloved son of Odin, dreamed of his death. His mother Frigg asked everything in the world not to harm him, but she overlooked one thing: the mistletoe. Loki tricked Balder's blind brother Hoder into throwing a dart of mistletoe. It killed Balder. The gods tried to bring him back. They sent Hermod to Hel to beg for his return. Hel said she would release him if all things wept for him. Everything did except for one giantess who refused. Some say it was Loki in disguise. And so Balder stayed dead. This story is rarely told in detail because it is tragic. The most loved god dies. The gods fail to bring him back, and his death becomes the signal for Ragnarok. The hidden truth here is that love could not stop fate. Even the tears of the world were not enough. The Norse also imagined terrifying creatures beyond the edges of their world. There were Jotnar that embodied ice and fire. There were sea serpents so vast they circled the earth. There were wolves that chased the sun and moon. One day they would catch them. For the Vikings, these were not fairy tales. They were symbols of fear. The long winter, the storm at sea, the eclipse that darkened the sky. Each monster explained a danger that could not be controlled. These myths are rarely told because they do not have neat endings. They are not stories of victory. They are stories of survival until the end. All of these hidden myths paint a darker picture of Norse belief. They show us gods who were fragile. They show us monsters that never rested. They show us death that touched everyone. They also show us how the Vikings lived in a harsh world and reflected that harshness in their stories. For them, myth was not escape. It was truth told in symbols. The truth that life is short. The truth that fate is certain. The truth that even gods fall. That is why the darker myths matter. They are not easy to hear, but they bring us closer to the real spirit of the North. When we look at the darker myths of the Vikings, we begin to understand something deeper about their culture. They lived in a land where the winters were long, where the sea could take a man in a moment, where sickness and hunger were constant threats. Their myths are not separate from this reality. They are reflections of it. Every monster, every curse, every vision of doom is a mirror of the world they knew. And in those reflections, we can see how they faced fear. The myth of Ragnarok is the clearest example. We often hear the simple version. The gods fight. The world burns. A new one rises. But if you look closely, the details are brutal. The sun is swallowed by a wolf. The stars vanish from the sky. The earth trembles so hard that mountains fall. The sea floods the land. Ships made of dead men's nails sail across the waters. Loki breaks free. Fenrir howls. Jormungandr rises from the sea and spreads poison across the world. The fire giant Surtur lifts his flaming sword and everything is consumed. This myth is not just about the end. It is about the terror of collapse. For the Vikings who told it, these images were not fantasy. They were possible. A harsh winter could wipe out villages. A storm could drown ships. A plague could empty halls. The myth gave shape to those fears, and also gave them a place in the cycle of life. One of the strangest details of Ragnarok is the ship Naglfar. It is said to be made from the nails of the dead. The more people died without proper burial, the stronger the ship became. This detail is rarely told. It reveals how burial customs were tied to cosmic fear. If nails were left uncut, the dead might add to Naglfar. If bodies were not cared for properly, they could fuel the final war. It was not only respect for the dead, it was fear that neglect could bring doom. This shows us how myth shaped behavior in daily life. Another rarely discussed part of Ragnarok is the role of Heimdall. He is often described as the watchman of the gods, the one who sees and hears everything. He blows the horn Gjallarhorn to announce the final battle. But in some versions, Heimdall and Loki kill each other. That image is striking. The guardian and the trickster falling together. Light and chaos, ending in silence. This detail is not always told because it adds another layer of loss. Not only do the great warriors fall, even the watchman, even the one who stood guard at the edge of Asgard, it shows that no defense can hold forever. The myths also tell us of survivors. After the flames die and the world sinks under the sea, two humans remain hidden in the wood of a tree. They are called Lif and Lifthrasir. They survive the night of destruction. They live in the new world that rises. This detail is often mentioned quickly, but it is important. It tells us that even in the darkest myth, the Vikings imagined renewal. They accepted that the world ends. They also believed that life begins again. This balance between doom and renewal is part of what makes their stories powerful. They are not only despair, they are cycles, death and rebirth, loss and return. But there are even more hidden myths beyond Ragnarok. One of them is about Ymir, the first giant. Many know that the world was made from his body. His blood became the seas. His flesh became the land. His bones became the mountains. His skull became the sky. But fewer know the detail that maggots grew in his flesh. From these maggots, the gods gave rise to dwarves. This is not a clean creation myth. It is a strange one. Life coming from decay, beauty coming from rot. The Vikings accepted this idea because they saw it in nature. From death came new life. From decay came growth. The hidden part is that the very beings who shaped wonders like weapons and jewels came from corruption. That twist is rarely emphasized, but it shows the Viking acceptance of paradox. Another myth that is often overlooked is about the mead of poetry. It was made from the blood of a wise being named Kvasir, who was killed by dwarves. They mixed his blood with honey and created a mead that gave wisdom and poetry to whoever drank it. Odin tricked and stole it. But the origin of the mead is disturbing. It comes from blood, from murder, from a crime. This detail is not told in simple retellings because it is dark, but it matters because it reveals that even the gift of art and poetry was born from violence. For the Vikings, beauty and brutality were never far apart. We also find darker sides of familiar gods when we look closely. Take Odin. He is often called wise and powerful, but his wisdom comes from sacrifice. He hung himself on Yggdrasil for 9 nights, pierced by a spear to gain knowledge of the runes. He gave up his eye to drink from the well of Mimir. His hunger for wisdom was so great that he endured pain and loss. This side of Odin is not always told in popular stories, but it shows the cost of knowledge. It shows that wisdom in Norse myth is not free. It is paid for with blood and suffering. Thor also has a hidden side. We see him as the strong protector who fights giants. But in some stories, he is tricked. He is mocked. Once he lost his hammer Mjolnir and had to disguise himself as a bride to get it back. The image of the mighty god of thunder in a dress is both comical and unsettling. It reveals that even the strongest god could be humiliated. These myths were not only about power, they also showed vulnerability. And perhaps they taught that laughter too was part of survival. Freya also carries hidden myths. She is often described as the goddess of love and beauty, but she also leads the Valkyries. She takes half of the dead warriors to her hall Folkvanger. Odin gets the other half. This is rarely highlighted. It means she is as much a goddess of death as of love. Her myths also speak of her crying tears of gold, a detail that is beautiful but also tragic. Love and sorrow are bound together in her image. The myths that are less told are the ones that make the Norse world more human. They show us weakness. They show us pain. They show us the strange origins of things we might take for granted. They reveal a worldview where nothing is simple. Even creation is bloody. Even poetry comes from murder. Even gods die. They are myths for people who lived with hardship every day. Think about the image of Nidhogg again, chewing at the roots of Yggdrasil while above the gods fight their wars. That is a picture of existence. Above is light and order. Below is decay. Both are true at the same time. The Vikings did not hide from this truth. They placed it at the center of their mythic tree. That is why these hidden myths matter. They tell us that the Vikings did not dream of a perfect world. They dreamed of a real one with joy and horror, one with laughter and blood, one where everything ends and begins again. The more we uncover these stories, the more we realize how layered Norse myth island. It is not only Thor swinging his hammer or Odin sitting on his throne. It is rot. It is fear. It is the beauty of creation born from violence. It is the sorrow of love that cannot stop death. It is fate written by hands no one can escape. These are the myths that are rarely told, and yet they may be the ones that bring us closest to the Viking soul. When we look deeper into the hidden side of Norse mythology, we find stories that are not only dark, but also strange and unsettling. These stories did not always survive in the clean versions that were written down centuries later. They lived in whispers, in songs, in fragments carried by memory. They show us a world that is both sacred and frightening. A world that does not try to hide the shadows, but brings them into the center of its vision. One of the most fascinating hidden myths is the story of Gullveig. Many people know her name only in passing, yet she is central to one of the biggest conflicts among the gods. The story says that she came to Asgard. She practiced powerful magic. Some say she taught the gods the art of cider. This was a kind of sorcery that bent fate and dealt with the unseen world. But the gods feared her power. They tried to kill her. They burned her 3 times, and 3 times she rose again. This detail is astonishing. A being who cannot die, who returns from the flames again and again. From her survival came the first war among the gods. The Aesir fought the Vanir. That war shaped the balance of power in the mythic world. The strange thing is that Gullveig is often left in the shadows. Some think she is another face of the goddess Freya. Others believe she is someone more mysterious. What matters is that her story reveals fear. The gods themselves were afraid of magic they could not control. They were willing to start a war rather than let it spread. And yet that magic did spread. It survived. Cider became part of their world. The detail of her burning and her return tells us that even fire could not erase what she brought. It is a myth about survival of knowledge, about fear of the unknown, about power that refuses to die. Another hidden story lies in the sagas of berserkers. Most people know the simple idea: warriors who fought with wild fury, men who bit their shields and roared like beasts. But the hidden detail is that their power was linked to trance, to ritual. Some say they drank strange brews. Others believe they used chants or even self-inflicted pain to reach that state. The sagas describe them as half-human, half-animal when the fury took them. Some say they could feel no iron or fire. Others say they howled like wolves and bore the strength of many men. What is rarely told is that this power also made them dangerous outside the battlefield. Berserkers could not always return to normal life. Some were feared in their own villages. Some were seen as cursed. There are hints that berserkers were connected to Odin himself. He was the god of frenzy and poetry. He was the master of both war and trance. This link shows us that their fury was not only madness, it was a sacred act, a dangerous gift. In the hidden side of the myth, berserkers are not only heroes, they are men who walked too close to the edge of the divine, and sometimes they did not come back. There are also darker tales about Loki. Many people know him as the trickster, the one who shifts shape, the one who causes trouble. But few remember the story of his punishment. After he caused the death of Balder, the shining god, he was captured. The gods bound him with the entrails of his own son. Above him, they placed a serpent whose venom dripped onto his face. His wife Sigyn held a bowl to catch the drops, but when she had to empty it, the poison burned Loki's skin. His screams shook the earth. That is the mythic origin of earthquakes. This detail is horrifying. It shows punishment not only as death, but as endless torment. It also shows loyalty. Sigyn staying by his side despite everything. This myth is rarely told in full because it is so grim, yet it is part of the hidden world of Norse belief. There are even more unsettling stories about Loki. In one myth, he shapeshifts into a mare to distract a giant stallion. In that form, he becomes pregnant and later gives birth to Sleipnir, Odin's eight-legged horse. This story is rarely told because it is strange and unsettling. It challenges simple ideas of gender and form. It shows a god who can cross every boundary, who can even give birth. Sleipnir becomes the greatest of horses, a gift born of trickery and transformation. This is the hidden side of myth, a reminder that nothing was fixed, that gods could shift beyond what we think is possible. The giants also carry hidden stories. They are usually seen as enemies, but many myths show them as lovers of gods. Thor himself took a giantess for a lover. Odin sought wisdom from giant women. Some of the greatest treasures of the gods came from giants. This detail matters because it breaks the simple picture of gods against giants. The hidden side shows a world of exchange, of conflict and union, of love and hate woven together. One forgotten myth is the story of the binding of Fenrir. Most know that the gods feared the great wolf. They tried to chain him with iron. He broke free. They tried again. He grew stronger. Finally, they made a chain from impossible things. The sound of a cat's footstep, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the breath of a fish, the spittle of a bird. With this chain called Gleipnir, they bound him. But the hidden detail is the cost. Tyr, the god of war, placed his hand in the wolf's mouth as a pledge. When Fenrir realized he was trapped, he bit Tyr's hand off. That is why Tyr is one-handed. This myth is told sometimes, but the depth of it is not always explored. It shows trust broken. It shows sacrifice. It shows that even gods must pay a price to bind chaos. There are also hidden myths about Hel. Many only know her as the ruler of the underworld, a daughter of Loki, half living and half dead. But some sagas describe her hall in chilling detail. It is called Eljudnir. Her plate is hunger. Her knife is famine. Her bed is sickness. Her curtains are misfortune. This is a place not of fire or torment, but of cold emptiness, a place of lack. This detail is rarely told because it is not dramatic, but it is terrifying in another way. It shows death as silence, as absence, as hunger that never ends. One of the strangest hidden stories is about Thor and his journey to the land of giants. He was given challenges that seemed simple: to lift a cat, to drink from a horn, to wrestle an old woman, but every task was an illusion. The cat was actually the world serpent. The horn was connected to the sea. The old woman was old age itself. Thor failed them all. This myth is rarely emphasized because it shows the god of strength failing. But it is powerful. It shows that even gods meet limits, that some forces cannot be beaten. Not by hammer, not by strength. These hidden myths reveal a different face of the Norse world. A world where gods are not invincible, where creation comes from death, where magic is feared but cannot be destroyed, where loyalty and betrayal stand side by side. They remind us that these stories were not written to comfort. They were written to make sense of a hard life. They were ways of facing fear, ways of shaping chaos into story. When we hear the myths that are rarely told, we see the Vikings more clearly. Not as simple warriors, not as heroes in shining armor, but as people who lived in a harsh land. People who told stories that matched the weight of their world. People who accepted that even gods suffer, that even the strongest fall, that even in endings there can be new beginnings. Now that we have walked through the shadows of Norse mythology, it is time to look back and see what all these hidden stories truly mean. The myths that are rarely told open a window into a world that is very different from the clean, heroic picture that many people carry in their minds. They show us gods who are vulnerable. They show us magic that frightens even the divine. They show us humans who step too close to the sacred and pay the price. And they show us that behind every legend there is a lesson written not in gold but in blood and in frost. When we think about Gullveig, we see how a single figure can change the balance of the entire cosmos. Burned 3 times and yet alive. Rising again with knowledge that could not be destroyed. Her presence forced gods into war. That is not the kind of story we find in heroic tales where good and evil are clear. This is something else. A reminder that power is not only a gift, but also a threat, and that fear of knowledge can lead even the gods to violence. When we hear of berserkers, we see that strength is not just a matter of muscle. It is something that comes from trance, from madness, from walking too close to the edge of what is human. These warriors were not always admired. They were feared, sometimes even cursed. The hidden myth tells us that too much closeness to the divine frenzy could tear a person apart. That power can bless, but it can also break. Loki's punishment reminds us that chaos has a price. He may have been clever, he may have been charming, but in the end his lies led to endless torment, bound with the entrails of his own child, poison dripping endlessly onto his skin. That image is far from the playful trickster we see in modern stories. It is a myth about suffering without end. A myth about the danger of betrayal among gods. Yet even here we see loyalty. Sigyn holding the bowl, staying by his side. Love surviving in the middle of punishment. The hidden story is not simple. It is both cruel and tender. Fenrir's binding shows us the fear of chaos and the cost of control. The gods were strong. They made a chain from impossible things. And yet, it only worked because one god paid with his hand. Sacrifice was needed even for them. The hidden myth tells us that no power is free. Every victory leaves a scar. Hell's Hall reminds us of a truth that is harder than fire or torment. The truth of emptiness. A hall where the bed is sickness, where the plate is hunger, where the curtains are misfortune. This vision of death is not loud, it is silent. It is the absence of all things. The hidden myth is not meant to scare with images of flames. It is meant to remind us that death can be colder than ice. Even Thor, who is often shown as unstoppable, faces defeat in the land of giants. He tries to lift a cat, but the cat is the serpent of the world. He tries to drink from a horn, but the horn is the sea itself. He tries to wrestle an old woman, but she is old age and no one can defeat her. This hidden story reminds us that even strength has limits, that even gods cannot conquer time, that humility is part of the myth as much as power. All these stories together give us a vision of Norse mythology that is richer and deeper than the usual picture. They are not tales of simple glory. They are lessons about fear and limits, about sacrifice and survival, about the strange truth that sometimes what we fear most is what cannot be destroyed. Why are these myths rarely told? Partly because they do not fit with the image of heroes we want to remember. Partly because they challenge ideas of order and stability. Partly because they are simply too strange or too grim for later storytellers. Yet it is in these myths that we find the true heartbeat of the Viking world. A world where life was hard. A world where people lived close to hunger and death. A world where the gods themselves struggled. When the Norse people told these stories by the fire, they were not only entertaining themselves, they were teaching their children how to see the world. They were explaining why earthquakes happen, why death feels cold, why war cannot be avoided. They were shaping chaos into meaning, and by listening, they could feel a little less alone in the face of endless night. This is why the hidden myths matter. They connect us to the raw core of human experience. They tell us that fear is ancient, that loss is ancient, that even in the worlds of gods and giants, nothing is easy or perfect. And they remind us that strength is not only found in victory, it is also found in survival, in standing again, after fire, in holding a bowl for the one you love, in giving a hand so that chaos can be bound, in facing old age with courage. So when we remember Norse mythology, we should not only recall Thor with his hammer or Odin with his wisdom. We should also remember Gullveig, who rose from fire, berserkers who howled like wolves, Loki bound in poison, Fenrir chained by sacrifice, Hel ruling in silence, Thor failing against forces greater than him. These are not small details. They are the very essence of the mythic world. And maybe that is why these myths speak to us today. Because we too live with fear. We too face forces we cannot control. We too know that sometimes survival itself is victory. The hidden stories of the Norse remind us that even in darkness there is meaning. Even in defeat, there is truth. Even in endings, there is a new beginning waiting. This is the legacy of the myths that are rarely told. They are not only stories from a faraway past, they are mirrors. They show us who we are. They show us what it means to be human. What do you think? Which of these hidden Norse myths surprised you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let us explore together the forgotten side of the Viking world. And if you want more journeys into the myths and sagas that shaped our ancestors, do not forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss the next tale from the age of gods and heroes.